Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished guests. It's an honor to be here. If I have any key message coming out of this presentation, it really is about unleashing the power of Earth observations. We've heard a lot this morning already about the environmental conditions here in the Arctic. And I guess what I would argue, whether it's an infrastructure issue, what we've also heard this morning, we have tremendous assets at our disposal, and yet we are not leveraging those assets. So this is about unleashing the power of Earth observations. Again, you've heard some of the comments this morning about Arctic sea ice. So you see an animation here from 1980 up to 2014. Of course, you can see seasonal or even annual variations in that, but the overall trend, certainly over that 30 or so years, is quite clear. And that has many implications that we've already talked about. When we talk about Earth observations, what do we mean? It is, in fact, any measurement that we take from the Earth. We'll talk a lot on this panel about those observations from space, and so you can see satellites, and yet there are tremendous in situ, in place observations. So whether those in place observations are in the atmosphere, in the ocean, or on land, or on sea or ice, our primary role is to in fact integrate this information so that they are in fact brought to bear on the widest suite of applications as possible. Many of these individual observations have been designed for a single discipline, and so when we talk about unleashing the power of these observations, it's taking those observations from one discipline and applying them to another discipline. This is just a sampling of some of those space-based observations. Now, these are largely operated by member states. Many of this in this room. We'll hear later on about the emerging role that the private sector is playing in Earth observations. Our goal as the Group on Earth Observations, and while we have UN member states at the table, we aren't actually a UN organization. It is an intergovernmental organization right now of 94 member states. Again, many of you in this room. If your country is not colored red on this graph or on this map, please come up and introduce yourself to me. I'd like to talk to you about that. You'll see that we've got fairly good coverage here in the Arctic region and in the Northern Hemisphere. But it's not just member countries that are important. And again, with all the references about ecosystems or the creation of villages, it is also about bringing those member states together with participating organizations, as shown here, whether they are UN organizations or scientific associations, or most importantly, and we've talked about this already this morning, is the emerging role of the private sector in Earth observations. So whether they are data providers, whether they are parts of the private sector that are going to add value to this information, or is it the downstream users in agriculture and energy and transportation, again, some that you've heard from. It is essential that this community work together to leverage the information, the Earth observations that it has at its disposal for the benefit of the issues here. This just happens to be a sampling of some of our individual partners here in the Arctic, whether they are member states, represented by their member states, or some of the scientific associations. And I think one of the challenges that we have are maybe the single discipline focus of many of these organizations. So some might be interested in biodiversity issues or migratory bird issues or transportation issues. And yet, if you want to leverage the power of Earth observations. We've got to share this data across these individual disciplines. Just real quickly, a graph that talks about the results of a change in data policy, in this case by the United States. It was for the Landsat satellite. For the first Landsat satellite was launched in 1972, and for 34 or 35 years, the U.S., whether it was the private sector or whether it was the government, sold the data. As soon as they used the Group on Earth observations to advertise a change in policy, you can see the takeoff of this data. 53 scenes a day were sold at the peak of data sales, 2001. Today, since 2008, 5,700 scenes of Landsat data are downloaded daily. That's 2 orders of magnitude. And so our argument is, if your governments are building satellites or weather stations or stream gauge stations or biodiversity networks, the citizens of not only the Arctic, but of your individual countries have paid for the construct of those public infrastructures, and to sell the data is limiting the uptake of that information. And there is, in fact, economic growth in this part of the curve. We absolutely want the private sector to come in and get access to this government data to build value-added products and services. So in closing, and I'm going to need a little help starting this animation, KL, what you will see here is some data from space. It doesn't happen to be an Icelandic volcano, it's in Italy. What you will see up the side is a color change as the displacement of this volcano is changing. You will see time, 24 months, 2 years across the bottom of the graph, and you will see pressure increasing up this graph. This is observed from space. Unfortunately, we no longer have the satellite that made these observations. It was a European satellite called ENVISAT. Let's just try to run it one more time real quick, KL. Look at the scale. This is in centimeters. So from space, we are seeing centimeter scale displacement 2 years in advance of this volcano actually blowing. So as the pressure increases in this volcano, can you imagine if you had a 2-year warning for many of the volcanoes globally, but particularly in this part of the world? So in closing, we have heard that the Arctic region impacts the globe, a little bit different perspective, both of topography on the land and bathymetry in the water, with the North Pole in the center of this graph. This illustration is courtesy of one of our geo-partners. It's from Japan. And so again, just changing the perspective of how people view this ecosystem, and also unleashing the power of information, particularly from that information that your governments have already spent time collecting, is very important. Our plenary meeting of those 94 member countries, 77 participating organizations, and the emerging private sector will be held the 13th and 14th of November in Geneva, Switzerland. Our website is here. So please, I'd be happy to, after we answer questions, I'd be happy to talk to any of you offline. Thank you very much.